Welcome to a story that sounds impossible, yet every word is documented. Before we begin, leave a comment about where you're watching from and what time you heard this account. London, England. Thursday, December 4th, 1952. The air was cold, bitterly cold. Temperatures had plummeted to levels not seen in years, and across the sprawling metropolis of 8 million souls, people did what they had always done when winter arrived. They burned coal. In every home, coal fires roared. Black smoke poured from millions of chimneys. In East London, factories still operated at full capacity, their smokestacks belching industrial pollution into the December sky. Along the Thames, massive coal-fired power stations, Battersea, Lots Road, and others, pumped thousands of tons of smoke, sulfur dioxide, and toxic compounds into the atmosphere. The diesel buses that had recently replaced London's electric tram system added their own contribution. The air smelled of sulfur and ash, but Londoners barely noticed. Smoky air was simply a fact of life in industrial London. But this December was different. An anticyclone, a high-pressure weather system, had settled over the city. Under normal conditions, warm air rises, carrying smoke and pollution away from ground level. But an anticyclone creates a temperature inversion. A layer of warm air sits above the city like a lid on a pot, trapping cold air and everything in it at ground level. There was no wind. The air was perfectly still. Every coal fire, every factory, every power station, every bus poured smoke and poison into air that had nowhere to go. The pollution simply accumulated hour after hour. And to make matters worse, higher quality coal was scarce that winter. The British economy was struggling, so the best coal was being sold abroad for desperately needed export revenue. What remained for London's homes and factories was lower-grade, sulfur-rich coal that produced far more smoke and toxins. Friday, December 5th, 1952. Dawn. Londoners woke to what appeared to be a typical winter fog. Nothing alarming. London was famous for its pea soupers, thick fogs that were an accepted part of winter life. By mid-morning, people began to notice something was wrong. The fog had a yellowish-black tint unlike anything they'd seen. It smelled acrid, burning the nose and throat. Eyes began to water. Those with respiratory conditions found themselves coughing. As the day progressed, the fog thickened. What had been 50 meters of visibility at dawn dropped to 20, then 10. People assumed it would burn off as the sun climbed higher. But the sun couldn't penetrate the thick layer of toxic air. Even at noon, London remained in perpetual twilight. By late afternoon, something unprecedented was happening. The fog was no longer just outside. It was seeping indoors, through cracks around windows, under doors, through ventilation systems. Inside homes and shops, a yellowish haze filled rooms. When nightfall came on December 5th, London entered a nightmare. The fog thickened to levels that defied comprehension. Visibility dropped to just a few meters, then to less than 1 meter. In the Isle of Dogs area, witnesses reported that they could not see their own feet. The fog had transformed into something more than fog. It was smog, a deadly combination of smoke, fog, sulfur dioxide, and toxic industrial pollutants. Every breath drew this poison into lungs. The city's transportation system began to collapse. Buses couldn't navigate streets where drivers couldn't see beyond their windshields. By Saturday morning, the majority of London's bus fleet was canceled. Cars were abandoned in the middle of roads, their drivers unable to continue and unable to find their way home on foot. Railway services were disrupted as engineers couldn't see signals. The London Underground continued, but passengers emerging from stations found themselves stepping into impenetrable darkness, even in daylight. Theaters canceled performances because audiences couldn't see the stages, even indoors. Concert halls went silent. The smog had penetrated everywhere, and people began to die. In hospitals across the city, emergency rooms started filling with patients struggling to breathe. Dr. Donald Atchison at Central Hospital found himself disoriented in the thick fog, having to feel his way along building walls just to read street names. Inside his hospital, the smog infiltrated the wards, and the morgue began to overflow with bodies, people gasping for breath in their final moments. The elderly arrived first, then those with existing lung conditions. But soon, previously healthy people came in, their faces gray, their lips blue. Death rates reached their highest level since the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918 to 1919. By the end of Saturday, estimates of the death toll were already reaching into the hundreds, though nobody knew the true scale yet. Sunday, December 7th, the third day. Outside the city, in the fields surrounding London, farmers made a horrific discovery. Cattle were dead in their fields, choked by the toxic air. The smog was so poisonous, it was killing livestock. Funeral directors began reporting something disturbing. Bodies were arriving faster than they could process them. The demand for hearses was becoming insatiable. And still, the weather refused to change. The anticyclone remained stationary, the temperature inversion intact, trapping the city under its deadly blanket. Every hour, more pollution poured into the air. Londoners had no choice but to keep burning coal. It was their only source of heat. The very act of trying to stay warm was making the crisis worse. By the end of Sunday, London had become a city of the blind, stumbling through poisonous darkness. And the worst was yet to come. Monday, December 8th, 1952. The fourth day. London was no longer a city. It had become a mausoleum. By this point, the death toll had climbed beyond counting. Official estimates would later claim 4,000 deaths, but in reality, 12,000 people had already passed, with thousands more lying in hospital beds, fighting for every breath. The smog remained absolute. It hadn't lifted. It hadn't thinned. It had only grown denser, more acrid, more lethal. Visibility had dropped so dramatically that even in the middle of the day, streetlights remained lit. Motorists drove at walking speed with their hazard lights flashing, and even then, multiple collisions occurred every hour as vehicles suddenly materialized out of the yellow-black void. Hospitals had become temples of death. Emergency wards were packed with patients gasping for breath, their lips blue, their skin the color of corpses. Nurses worked in shifts that blurred into nightmares, patient after patient, each one struggling as their lungs filled with fluid, their bodies unable to extract oxygen from the toxic air. Dr. Donald Atchison documented what he witnessed. The patients came in droves. We couldn't keep up. Every bed was taken, and we were putting people on chairs and floors. The sound, I can still hear the sound of all those people struggling to breathe. The primary cause was respiratory failure, but it wasn't simple suffocation. The smog's particles, sulfur compounds, soot, industrial chemicals, coated the lungs' delicate lining, triggering violent inflammation. Fluid accumulated in the air sacs where oxygen absorption should occur. Patients developed pneumonia, bronchitis, and in many cases, complete respiratory tract collapse. Those who died often experienced their final hours in conscious awareness of their own drowning. They gasped, they clawed at their own throats. And then, mercifully, their exhausted bodies surrendered. The elderly were dying first. Men and women over 45 had mortality rates 10 to 15 times higher than normal. But the smog didn't discriminate. Children were dying too. Infants and toddlers, their lungs still developing, succumbed within hours to respiratory infections they couldn't fight. In one pediatric ward, a nurse watched 7 children die in a single day. She would later recall standing in the yellow-tinted ward, knowing that every breath she took was poisoning the children she was trying to save. Funeral directors across London made a decision that still haunts the historical record. They began asking families to delay viewings. There simply weren't enough caskets. The funeral industry, which had operated for centuries without crisis, was suddenly overwhelmed. Bodies were stacked in temporary storage. Some were placed in mass storage facilities because individual funeral homes ran out of space. The scale of death was so sudden and so overwhelming that the funeral industry couldn't process it. Outside the hospitals, the city was descending into chaos. Emergency vehicles couldn't reach patients. Ambulances with sirens blaring still needed an average of 20 minutes to travel distances that normally took 3 minutes. People simply called off ambulances, knowing help wouldn't arrive in time, and instead tried to make their own way to hospitals through the lethal fog. Those who ventured outside wore whatever protective gear they could fashion. Handkerchiefs soaked in water tied over the mouth and nose provided zero protection but offered psychological comfort. Those with money-purchased gas masks designed for chemical warfare, relics of World War II. The poor simply breathed the poison. Crime skyrocketed. The smog provided perfect cover for criminals who moved through the fog like ghosts. Pickpockets worked crowds gathering at bus stops. Burglaries increased 30% as thieves exploited the inability of police to respond or even to see. At Smithfield Meat Market, one of London's largest livestock markets, a horrific scene unfolded. Cattle being held for auction began gasping, their eyes wide with panic. Within hours, dozens of animals had collapsed, their lungs destroyed by the toxic air. The smell of death mixed with the sulfurous smog created an almost unbearable atmosphere. Farmers who had brought their animals to market stood helplessly as their livestock died, asphyxiated by the very air around them. The psychological impact was devastating. People felt as if the world was ending. Parents held their children close, uncertain whether they would survive to see morning. The smog was so complete, so total in its control, that it felt apocalyptic. Monday night was the worst. The smog thickened even more as evening came. Visibility dropped to less than a meter in some areas. The darkness was absolute and suffocating. Inside homes, people huddled around coal fires that continued to pour poison into the air. The very fires they were burning to stay warm were killing them. The paradox was complete. The more they heated their homes, the worse the smog became, and the more people died. By Tuesday morning, December 9th, something changed. The wind began to blow, just slightly at first, but the anticyclone was breaking down. The trap that had held London captive for 5 days was beginning to open. By evening, the smog started to lift. Visibility improved from inches to feet, then to meters. By the next day, the sun was visible for the first time in nearly a week. London emerged from the fog to confront what it had experienced. In the weeks that followed, death continued. The lungs of survivors were damaged, infected, scarred. Pneumonia and bronchitis rates remained elevated for months. An additional 8,000 people died in the months following the smog, their bodies finally surrendering to the damage the poison had inflicted. The government would eventually officially acknowledge 4,000 deaths. But modern research has revealed the true toll. Approximately 12,000 people died, either immediately or in the subsequent months, as a direct result of the Great Smog of 1952. More people died in 5 days of smog than in any other single pollution event in British history. And the government was already planning how to hide it. The smog had lifted by December 10, 1952. London could finally breathe again. The sun was visible. The air, while still polluted, was no longer lethal. The government had a problem. On December 19th, just days after the worst of the smog had cleared, the Ministry of Health issued an official statement. The fog, they claimed, had caused approximately 4,000 deaths. This was the figure they would repeat publicly. This was the number that would be recorded in official histories for decades. It was a lie. Even at the time, officials knew it was a lie. E.T. Wilkins, the government's own officer in charge of atmospheric pollution, effectively Britain's top pollution expert, had plotted the actual death data. His chart, which remained hidden from public view, showed something terrifying. There had been an additional 8,000 deaths beyond those initially counted, making the true toll approximately 12,000 people. Wilkins presented his findings to the government. He was effectively silenced. Why would the government deliberately undercount the deaths by 200%? The answer was political survival. Britain in 1952 was already struggling economically. A massive industrial disaster, caused by the very coal fires that kept Britain warm and fueled its industries, was politically catastrophic. If the government admitted that 12,000 people had died due to industrial pollution, it would demand immediate action. Action that would be expensive. Action that would hurt industry. Action that could destabilize a fragile economy. So the government created an alternative narrative. In official communications and cabinet meetings in the late 1950s, government officials deliberately shifted blame away from air pollution. Instead, they promoted a different culprit: cigarette smoking. The logic was simple. If people were getting lung disease and lung cancer, the government argued, it was because they smoked, not because they breathed poisoned air. If people stopped smoking, the government reasoned, lung disease would go away, and nobody would demand pollution regulations. The strategy was devastating in its effectiveness. Resources that might have gone to controlling industrial pollution were instead directed toward anti-smoking campaigns. Decades of public health focus shifted from environmental protection to individual responsibility. Meanwhile, air pollution continued to kill thousands across Britain. The government's secret documents, which contained E.T. Wilkins's data, Wilkins's analysis, and explicit acknowledgement of the 12,000 deaths, remained locked in filing cabinets. Officials who knew the truth died with it. It would take 50 years for the truth to emerge. Not until 2002, half a century after the smog, were secret government documents declassified, revealing the deliberate cover-up. Researchers studying these documents confirmed that officials had known the true death toll and deliberately suppressed it. Dr. Stephen Kelly, who analyzed these long-hidden documents, was blunt in his assessment. The government knew exactly what had happened. They had the data. They had the analysis. And they chose to lie to protect industry and maintain political stability. In February 1953, 2 months after the smog, Labour MP Marcus Lipton stood in the House of Commons and challenged the government's figures. He presented evidence that the fog had caused at least 6,000 deaths, possibly more. He noted that 25,000 more people had claimed sickness benefits in London during that period. The government dismissed his concerns. Dr. Wilfred Schultes, the chief medical officer, acknowledged that mortality had been elevated, but dismissed it as an influenza epidemic. This was demonstrably false. The pattern of deaths showed that air pollution, not influenza, was the culprit. The government knew this. They lied anyway. The impact of this cover-up extended far beyond the 1950s. The Clean Air Act, finally passed in 1956, 4 years after the Great Smog, was far less stringent than it should have been. It was a compromise, a half measure designed to placate public outcry without genuinely threatening industry. The act allowed for smokeless zones, but it did little to address the fundamental problem of coal-fired power stations. When these measures were implemented, they did work. London's air began to improve. But this improvement came only after a cover-up had robbed the nation of years when more aggressive action could have been taken. Decades later, when researchers finally analyzed the true impact of the Great Smog, they discovered something else. Children exposed to the smog in utero or in infancy showed measurable cognitive and respiratory effects throughout their lives. They had lower IQ scores. They had worse lung function. They developed respiratory diseases at higher rates. The 12,000 who died were just the immediate toll. The true cost was generational, and none of it needed to happen. The technology to prevent the smog, better coal, clean smokestacks, industrial regulation, building insulation standards, existed in 1952. It was affordable. It was politically inconvenient. So the government chose to let 12,000 people die. And then they lied about it for 50 years. That's what the declassified documents reveal. That's the truth that emerged in 2002. And that's the warning this tragedy carries into our present day. What happened in London in 1952 was supposed to be a warning so dramatic, so undeniable, that humanity would never again allow corporate interests to override public health. We did not learn. The Clean Air Act of 1956 did work in Britain. It was the first major environmental legislation in history. It established smoke control areas where residents could only burn smokeless fuels for heat. Slowly, over decades, London's air improved. By 1962, another smog occurred, but it was far less severe, and Britain had learned to respond more effectively. The Great Smog had triggered genuine reform. But this reform was an exception. Around the world, industrial pollution only accelerated. Cities in Asia, Eastern Europe, and North America experienced air quality as bad as or worse than London's. Yet governments repeated the same mistakes Britain had made. Today, air pollution kills more people globally than any single disease. According to the World Health Organization, over 7 million people die annually from air pollution-related causes. This is more deaths than from malaria, tuberculosis, and HIV combined. And the pattern of cover-up continues. Delhi presents the clearest example. The Indian capital experiences air quality regularly worse than London's during the Great Smog. Yet the government consistently downplays the severity, just as Britain's government did. Deaths from air pollution have climbed from 15,786 in 2018 to 17,188 in 2023, a 9% increase in just 5 years. Yet political will to address root causes remains minimal. The causes are exactly what they were in 1952: coal burning, vehicle emissions, industrial pollution. The same pollutants, the same governmental resistance to regulation, the same pattern of protecting industry over human life. Beijing presents a different story. In 2005, China's air pollution deaths reached an estimated 2.6 million annually. Beijing's air was as bad as Delhi's today. Then, in 2013, the government implemented the Air Pollution Prevention and Control Action Plan. The plan was aggressive, shutting down coal power plants, restricting industrial emissions, banning coal burning for heating in cities, imposing strict vehicle emission standards. Within 5 years, PM 2.5 levels, the most dangerous air pollutant, had dropped 33%. Sulfur dioxide emissions fell 54%. The reduction likely prevented 44,240 premature deaths in 74 Chinese cities in just 5 years. Beijing today still has air quality problems, but it proved something critical. The problem is solvable when governments prioritize action. This is the ultimate lesson of the Great Smog of 1952. It wasn't that air pollution is deadly. We knew that. It wasn't that the problem is solvable. We knew that too. It was that governments will cover up the deaths, minimize the scale, blame individuals rather than industries, and delay action as long as possible. And they do it again. Governments today are repeating the exact pattern Britain followed in 1952. They acknowledge air pollution exists, but undercount the deaths. They blame individual behavior, smoking, driving cars, rather than systemic industrial pollution. They delay aggressive action. We have the technology to fix this. We have proven models. Beijing demonstrates it's possible. We have documentation of what works and what doesn't. What we lack is political courage. And people continue dying. In the 70 years since the Great Smog, air pollution has killed an estimated 500 million people globally, more than all wars, famines, and epidemics of the same period combined. 12,000 people died in London in 5 days in 1952. This was so catastrophic that it triggered the first major environmental legislation in history. Today, 7 million people die annually from air pollution, nearly 19,000 per day, every day, year after year. Yet this doesn't trigger the same urgency. Perhaps because the deaths are distributed across the planet, concentrated in Delhi, Beijing, Cairo, cities with poor and marginalized populations rather than wealthy Western capitals. Perhaps because the industry causing the problem is now global and governments are invested in the profits. Perhaps because we have collectively decided that convenience is worth the cost. The declassified documents from 1952 reveal something haunting. British officials knew they deliberately chose corporate interests over human lives. Why? Because nobody stopped them. The public didn't demand justice. The media didn't expose the cover-up at the time. 50 years passed before the truth emerged. Now, in our own time, we face the same choice Britain faced in 1952. We can pretend air pollution is an unfortunate byproduct of development, too complex to solve. Or we can demand action. We can demand that our governments prioritize clean air over corporate profits. We can support governments that implement aggressive pollution controls, as Beijing has done. We can refuse to accept undercounting of deaths. We can refuse to let the pattern repeat. The Great Smog of 1952 killed 12,000 people in 5 days. Today, air pollution kills that many people every 9 hours. The warning has been issued. 7 decades have passed. The question now is not whether we know the problem. We do. The question is whether we will finally act.